Can everybody hear me? I like to make sure everybody can hear me. That's nothing worse than not being able to hear half of a presentation. Thank you for the warm welcome. I've thoroughly enjoyed my trip to Omaha. This is the first time I've been out this way. I've been on the opposite side of the state to Scottsbluff, but this is my first time here in Omaha, and it's been a wonderful visit so far. So I'm going to tell you about the Ritchie Boy training. As he said, I'm the director of the Ritchie History Museum. I'm pleased to discuss the Camp Ritchie and, of course, the Ritchie Boy training and our institution a little bit with you. I'm not an expert on the Ritchie Boys, and I always tell people that. I am more focused on becoming the Camp Ritchie expert, which in itself is a lot. Because we date 1926 to 1951 was Camp Ritchie, and then from 51 to 1998 was Fort Ritchie. And then we had a lot go on after that until modern day. But over the past 2 years, I've dedicated my time to studying maps, schematics, lots of training materials from the Ritchie Boy courses, and documents regarding the history of Camp Ritchie, all the way up, and on Fort Ritchie, all the way up till the closing in 1998. So obviously there's a substantial history there. When you think about, if you know anything about military, you know things change a lot. So of course, that history has changed a lot over this short 75 years or so. Our museum showcases all of that history, but we do have a substantial exhibit to the Ritchie Boys. About half of our museum focuses on their training. So we have focused on mainly the 8-week program, but we also did have other specialized training, such as the Counterintelligence Corps, as well as OSS. So there was other specialized training going on at Ritchie aside from just the 8-week interrogation course. But before we get started, I want to define for you what a Ritchie boy or a Ritchie girl, because we had ladies there too, what we say is a Ritchie boy and Ritchie girl, because it can be debated. It has been debated among some circles. But we count everybody that passed through the gates of Camp Ritchie as a Ritchie boy or Ritchie girl. You may wonder why somebody that didn't graduate would be considered, why are they a Ritchie boy or Ritchie girl if they never received a certificate? Well, it's simple. A lot of our men and some of our women were pulled early for assignments. For example, we had a group of Italian soldiers that were pulled early to go to North Africa for the invasion of Sicily. So we don't think it's fair to say, no, you're not a Ritchie boy or no, you're not a Ritchie girl, because they more than earned the right to be called that. They still went, they still did their job, and they still used their training from Camp Ritchie. So that's the way the museum views it, though other people may have a different definition. So I'm going to give you a little bit of back history on Camp Ritchie. Camp Ritchie was established originally as the Buena Vista Ice Harvest and was several farms. In 1926, the Maryland National Guard acquired the property to be a summer training camp. At the time, Major General Milton Record assigned Captain Robert F. Barrick to oversee construction on the camp. He was the main engineer. Despite only having a 7th grade education, Barrick was more than up to the task. A majority of the buildings still standing today at Fort Ritchie, unless they've been torn down by a previous company, were his work. So if you ever visit us, all of the large stonework is all done by him, and all locally sourced as well. Majority of our buildings are solid concrete and Catoctin greenstone, which makes them pretty much immovable. We joke that the museum is our bunker. It's our safe house. So Barrick was promoted to major in 1937, remained the engineer throughout World War II all the way up until 1947. But we'll go back a little bit to around mid-1941. Now, according to the Daily Mail, the military began planning what you call recreation camps. We still have some of these today, where soldiers could escape the stressors of modern warfare and relax. And if you ever visit Ritchie, it would have been the perfect place for that as well. But Camp Ritchie was designated for this purpose for the 3rd Corps, which consisted of the Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia area. However, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941, those plans changed quickly. Given the camp's existing infrastructure, the local terrain, we had a railroad spur that ran through the property off of a main railroad line, and its proximity to Washington, D.C., it became the primary training ground of the group we would eventually call the Ritchie Boys in June of 1942. The property was leased by the U.S. Army for $1 a year. I don't know that you would get that same deal today. Above on the slides, you can see that's the original consolidation plot map from where the state purchased the property, around 631 acres total. And that is Robert Barrick, along with below him is the picture of what we call the castle. There's a lot of lore as to why he chose the castle. It was originally built as a visitor center for the National Guard, but it became the commandant's offices during World War II. Before we dig into the training, though, I would like to give you an idea of what the camp looked like, because that played a lot into the terrain and everything about Ritchie and why it was chosen. This is a map of Camp Ritchie from around it would help if I changed the slide, wouldn't it? Sorry. From around 1942. We believe that this map was used to mark buildings for repurposing and as well as mark new buildings to be constructed. Unfortunately, normally maps like this from the military have a lovely side with lots of information on it. Whoever took the map from Camp Ritchie decided he didn't want that part, and he cut it off and framed this portion. But we do estimate the date according to buildings that are and are not present. And I'm going to point out a few of the buildings and their uses so you have an idea of when I start talking about training, these are the places that they spent their time. So, the aerial photo is actually from World War II, so that gives you a little bit more of a visual. So all these blacked-in buildings would have been the new ones. The theater is vitally important because that is where the CSU, our composite school unit, which we will discuss, did a lot of their reenactments and did a lot of more in-depth training, which we'll get to. These lovely, long, skinny little, we call them the finger buildings because they look like fingers on the map. Those were all training classrooms. That's where they did a lot of their classroom work. We've been digging into exactly what was taught where. Majority of what I could find was German Army and those types of classes taught here, and then most of the Japanese and radio taught on the other side. The two large buildings, 360 and 160, are twin buildings. They were turned into the mess hall. One of our most popular buildings still as today, and if you look up Camp Ritchie, you'll see lots of pictures of it, is our Lakeside Hall, which for the Maryland Guard was an open club. World War II, the officers get the good stuff. They turned it into the Officers Club, which your grandfather would have visited. Or your father would have visited your grandfather, sorry. And then, of course, the new post headquarters was a lifeblood of the camp, as well as photo lab for the aerial and photo interpretation courses, and then combat was actually in the old motorcade, which was much smaller. So this just gives you an idea of what the camp looked like. It grew a lot more over the years, but this was it during World War II. One of our favorite buildings, there's not many of our World War II era constructed buildings still standing. They did put a motor pool on the far side of Lake Royer. And then they had the theater and the chapel. Many of you, if you look up Fort Ritchie, you'll see wedding pictures and things like that from World War II. We were fortunate enough to get the Kaufman-Boucher collection this past summer, and they are prominent on our boards and things outside. Her husband proposing to her, they were both instructors at Camp Ritchie. So that just gives you a little idea of what the buildings were, and the aerial view, of course, gives you a little bit more of what it looked like. Just to give you the last little interesting bit about the buildings, these little squares, those are all cement platforms. There were no barracks at Camp Ritchie. It was summer training camp, so they rotated out. So during World War II, they had to pull up all of these cement platforms and construct barracks, which are all in the back, the very back of that aerial photo, long white temporary barracks. Unfortunately, don't stand today because it was temporary constructed. Most of the materials were loaded with asbestos, and the previous companies didn't want to, unfortunately, at least redo one of them, so they tore them down. So in 1942, Camp Ritchie was converted from the Maryland Guard Summer Training Camp into a Military Intelligence Training Center, or you'll hear me refer to it as an MITC. The military still uses the acronym today, and they love their acronyms, of course, so you'll see a lot more throughout the presentation. I do explain what each one is. But on an amusing note, the many Ritchie boys are quoted as saying that MITC stood for Military Institute of Total Confusion. It merited this for many reasons, and I think it could probably still apply today. It was partially because everyone there had to at least speak one other language other than English. Roughly 20,000 trainees passed through the gates of Camp Ritchie, all selected for their multilingual skills. Of the soldiers who went through the program, around 20% were German and Austrian refugees. We lumped those together because at the time the camp opened, Austria had already been annexed into Germany. Another 60% were all American born, and the rest were foreign nationals. On average, around 70 countries were represented at Camp Ritchie. Just to name a few, you had French, German, Italian, Russians, Turks, Spanish, Native Americans, Japanese, who we call the Nisei, which means first generation, Mongolians, and many, many more. A wide variety of different languages being spoke, of course, gave the atmosphere at the camp a unique kind of Babel sounding, as the Ritchie boys would be quoted saying, that gave it an air of confusion with all of the different languages. Now, Camp Ritchie wasn't just diverse in language and ethnicities. Again, we have had 200 of our Women's Army Corps were stationed at Camp Ritchie, and they played a vital role as well in training, and it oversees many in the Pacific and in Europe. So while Camp Ritchie was somewhat chaotic, to say the least, there was an individual responsible for organizing and developing this intelligence program. His name was Brigadier General Charles Y. Banfield, and he is behind his desk in the far image in the castle. Banfield was a World War I veteran pilot and was also at the time Assistant Chief of Military Intelligence Service during his time at Camp Ritchie. So he facilitated a lot of our communications between Camp Ritchie and Washington, D.C. Excuse me. Banfield believed it was essential that for all trainees, Ritchie boys, and most of the girls, to gain knowledge in every aspect of battle. Their curriculum included a variety of classes and communication methods, such as field radio, Morse code, carrier pigeon, which we have our training manual that was donated by the Kaufman and Boucher family. They did document analysis, German and Japanese Army organization, Allied forces, foreign equipment, close combat, combat propaganda, and there were a lot more. That was just to name a few of the actual classes they took. They also had further language training. Just because you spoke another language didn't necessarily mean you knew all the military language. You have military technical terms, and then you have military slang. So they actually had to take courses to learn all of this. The training schedule was full of intensive activities, both in the classroom and in the field. With very little downtime. We actually listened to your grandfather in his recording. He just backs that up even more. That very little downtime, what was spent was probably spent studying or trying to get sleep. Pictured on the slide is Class 16's schedule. Now this is just period 4. One period was 7 days. It was much like a college roster, telling the when, what, and where of that training for that day. The class was broken into sections, and each section would be assigned to a specific activity in a specific location, all broken down on that. I'm sorry, it's not very visible. But and the back of it also had, again, almost like a college syllabus, what you would need for the course. Now, Colonel Banfield was not alone in developing and implementing the training program. Initially, there were 6 instructors, and in a short time after opening the MITC, 3 more were added. The original section leaders included Terrain Intelligence, ran by Raymond Grazier, Signal Intelligence, George LeBlanc, Staff Duties, Arthur Jorgensen, Counterintelligence, William Piper, Aerial Photo Interpretation, Theodore Fuller, Enemy Armies, Charles Warndorf. The additional sections and leaders added later were Military Intelligence, ran by Delbert Pryor, Close Combat was ran by Rex Applegate, and Visual Demonstration was ran by George Weber. Each one of these section leaders wasn't just a section leader. He was also an instructor himself, and they oversaw a large number of other instructors. The bottom picture there is some of the German staff, what they call the German staff at Fort Ritchie. We were fortunate to acquire a collection from Charles Warndorf's family. He's the section leader over Section 5, Enemy Armies, I just mentioned. And he's noted for making incredible contributions to the interrogation section, honing an exceptional program by contributing principles taught, which we will discuss here shortly. Now, one of the main areas of concentration was identification of the enemy. All 3 main focuses in training, which were photo analysis, interrogations, and order of battle, had something to do with identification, of course, identifying the enemy. Warndorf, along with his skilled instructors, conducted comprehensive classes aimed specifically at recognizing the German army. These vibrant classroom sessions were designed to be dynamic and interactive, allowing students to immerse themselves in the learning experience. Warndorf engaged his audience in in-depth lessons and supported by practical demonstration that showcased the distinctive features of the German army. In this setting, he can be seen actively instructing his students on the various elements of German uniforms, which was a huge deal. They had to be able to identify every part of a uniform by simply looking at it. The poster, actually on the bottom, is one of the training exercises, which is, it's probably about as big as the actual one on the screen. It had a first page to it that would have been put up on a board with pegs on it, and they would have cut out the uniform insignias, folded the tab back, and then they had to place it, and they would do identification trainings and things like that. This is one of those that wasn't used that came into our collection. Now, to enhance identification training, the military recognized that Camp Ritchie needed specific items for practice. Most of the German equipment and uniforms used for training at Camp Ritchie were captured during the North African campaigns. The Ritchie boys had to learn to identify, again, all the uniforms, including their components, medals, insignia. Being surrounded by these items daily reinforced their classroom training. Identification was crucial in intelligence, as observing a uniform could tell you valuable information such as troop movements or information on somebody you're about to interrogate. You can see in the photos, it's one of my favorites. The gun that's most prominent in the bottom photo is an 88 millimeter flak gun, which is anti-aircraft, and a long line of other artillery behind it, all captured. The one to the right is a Japanese charging panel that we were fortunate enough to have donated to our collection as on exhibit. So they not just used just the artillery and uniforms, but they also, any kind of equipment they could get their hands on was used for training. Now this is one of my favorite photos. Although we utilized many captured items, of course not all items could be transported. It's kind of hard to send back panzers. They're a little heavy. So instructors got creative. The picture here of tanks you see is not real German tanks. If you look just below the front, you can see tires. They were Jeeps. Again, one of my favorite pictures because it got me my first time at the museum, and Beverly pointed it out to me. So they got really creative, and when they lacked the necessary item, they created it. The Ritchie students often would take to the mountains or different areas, and groups like this would come by and they would have to do identification practices on these artillery, transport vehicles, whatever they were specified in the classroom material at the time. Therefore, the replicas had to be as realistic as possible, and considering most of these are made out of plywood, I think they're quite convincing. I think they did a pretty good job for the time limit they had in making these. Now, when it comes to training, to me, one of the most interesting aspects of the Ritchie Boy training was the field exercises and immersive experiences. Colonel Banfield again believed that immersing soldiers into what combat was like, what they would see, what they would hear, the entire experience, he wanted them to be prepared for anything and be able to perform their duty to the best of their ability, no matter the situation. You can imagine if you're in combat and bombs and things are going off around you and you're having to collect intelligence, it can be rather difficult. So the training, of course, proved to be effective, as the Ritchie boys themselves in many interviews, if you might have been in I think it's in the documentary too, Ritchie boys noted that nothing surprised them after their training at Camp Ritchie. That's how immersive it was. At least not the combat anyways. The students at Camp Ritchie basically entered a mock war zone. When they got off the train at Camp Ritchie and entered, you was nothing to see SS uniforms or German Army uniforms, all of the above, anything and everything you could think of when it came to our enemies. This includes, which far left or far right, my right, your left, I guess, is our life-size German village, which looks much like a movie set. It was made of timbers, plywood, and burlap. And there were different businesses and homes. And in this village, soldiers would do activities such as learn how to clear and secure a town, among anything else. And the groups came up with as realistic an Axis force as they could muster for these scenarios. It often involved soldiers dressed up as German snipers hiding in windows or on rooftops, waiting for the unsuspecting Ritchie boy to come by. One exercise that I found to be slightly disturbing, and I can only imagine it walking around the camp myself, was the mock air raids. As I mentioned, Banfield was a World War I veteran pilot. So occasionally, he would go to the Waynesboro Airport, which we used for aircraft identification as well. It's about 15-20 minutes from us. And he would get in his Piper Cub and drop what was called bombs, 5-pound bags of flour from his airplane onto the unsuspecting troops. And anyone caught with flour on them throughout the day would receive a demerit. Too many demerits, you get the boot. Fortunately, I don't have any records of that happening to anybody, so they got good at dodging the flour at least. Couldn't imagine having that siren go off and have somebody dropping bags of flour at me, much less the real thing. So you may be wondering who did all of these, who are these groups that I'm talking about that did the acting for the training at Camp Ritchie? Well, it was a specialized group of actors and actresses who filled the necessary roles. They were called, again, the Composite School Unit. You'll hear me call them the CSU, just for short. The CSU was divided into 10 platoons for designated demonstrations. You had headquarters platoon, artillery, 1st rifle, 2nd rifle, 30 caliber machine gun, 81 millimeter mortar, anti-tank, engineer, and interrogations. Each platoon focused on their specialty, but all members trained in bicycle, motorcycle, rifle, and machine gun units. The goal of the CSU was to prepare the Ritchie boys by providing them with visualization and experiences involving the enemy in various types of war situations. In the next few slides, we will discuss a few of these experiences. Here pictured is a group of the CSU. It's the 81 millimeter mortar group and the 30 cal machine gun group, and you can see them with their artillery pieces or firearms. So training occurred not just on the property of Camp Ritchie, but throughout the surrounding region. It depended on what the military needed for training, what type of terrain. They would often use local farms to demonstrate any kind of terrain that they needed. Participants here in the upper right image in the corner are dressed as Japanese soldiers. During these events, those that were fluent in Japanese would be speaking Japanese. They would be dressed as Japanese, and they would be in a place that would be wooded and marshy, trying to make it as much like a jungle as possible. They would demonstrate different types of things like entanglements, defense positions, camouflage, different types of traps, booby traps, bunkers, communication trenches, again, anything involving combat. The other image on the far right or far left is a group of the Germans doing different exercises, and then of course the Japanese on the bottom again. It was mainly German and Japanese, of course. Now, of course, it was more than just identification to further illustrate the psychology of the enemy, because that was vital in what the Ritchie boys would do. The CSU organized demonstrations that included mock Nazi rallies, as realistic as possible, as shown on the accompanying slide. They paid meticulous attention to the detail, including uniforms, signs, and the behaviors. The photos displayed are from our Warndorf collection. This image on the far left is labeled Hitler Rally 1943 to 1944. Portraying Hitler in this demonstration is Captain Nowak. As mentioned before, Warndorf, of course, was a very well-respected individual. And you can see the other image is autographed by Captain Nowak, and it reads, "To Lieutenant Colonel Warndorf, with my sincerest respects, de Fuhrer." And then it's signed with his name, of course. Another infamous figure depicted here is also Hermann Göring, played by Master Sergeant Frank S. Leavitt. Leavitt himself was quite famous. I'm going to point him out at least on this slide. As you can probably guess, because Göring was quite rotund. That is Mr. Leavitt. He was famous himself as he was a pro wrestler in the early 1900s, standing at 5'11" and at a build wrestling weight of 310 pounds. He was definitely the ideal person to play Göring, I believe. I don't think anybody at the base could come close to matching that. This is another fun aspect of their training. The CSU engaged in more than just the mock demonstrations and Nazi rallies. They often created comedic performances for various reasons, but mostly to emphasize the importance of confidentiality among the soldiers. The scene sketched on the right is from the play, which we have the scripts, M1 American Mouth. And to just illustrate a little bit of the humor, I pulled a small piece from the first page. And the narrator starts by giving the nomenclature of a weapon that is little known and often not well understood. To quote, "It's the United States automatic, gas-operated, lung-fed, always loaded, low caliber, semi-witted, big American mouth, the greatest repeater ever invented." They had a good sense of humor. So while training was very serious, they did throw in some comedic and sense of humor mixed in to help them remember. The other picture is actually the composite school units believe I put the one that actually has William Warfield, but they had other plays, those two signs, one of them's keep it under your helmet and things like that. They also put these play titles on matchbooks and distributed them to the soldiers. Not to mention the other vital information the Ritchie boys would have had access to or known. And comedy was a great way to remind the soldiers to keep their work to themselves. I can say this worked. Most Ritchie boy families I encounter start with a number of different phrases. It's usually, we never knew, or he never spoke about his service. Of course, there were a few that were around when the military declassified everything in the mid-90s and were able to give us firsthand accounts of what they did. But for the most part, a lot of the families up until that point say that nobody ever told them anything. I think I've encountered one that came in telling me things that they probably shouldn't have known before mid-90s. But all the above demonstrations and identification played into the three main focuses of training. First, photo analysis was a primary source of intelligence, accounting for 90% of all intelligence. That's not actionable intelligence, all intelligence gathered during World War II. All students underwent at least the basic course in interpreting photographs. They were taught to read this landscape. They would be looking for things like, again, enemy features, strong points, caches of weapons possibly, defensive, mostly camouflaged things. The basic course required the students to stay on the ground for the exercise and test. In contrast, the more advanced course necessitated that students take to the air in one of our 5 aircraft for training at Ritchie. Only the most exceptional students would be selected for the advanced course in photo intelligence. Now to show you a little bit of the picture, the page closest to me is actually the measurements used to track American military artillery and things like that in traveling positions. So they even had to know the sizes of everything in different positions because, of course, you're not going to shoot in the same position you're going to haul something. Order of battle was again vital for all of the Ritchie boys. They studied and memorized detailed information about the German military hierarchy, unit structures, troop movements, and weaponry, allowing them to effectively interrogate, capture German soldiers to gather the critical intelligence they needed during the war. Excuse me. These are a few of the training materials from that class. The diagrams on the screen are some of the coursework. The bottom far left is the typical German armed recon battalion, and the other shows the German infantry weapons. The unique part about this is they didn't have to just know what the weapon was. They had to know the rate of fire, which is listed here, the effective range, how many a designated squad may have with them during the time, and of course the type. But it wasn't just knowing what the weapon was, you had to know details about the weapon. Another interesting point, I'm sorry, I hope you guys can see. On the recon battalion, you'll see a bunch of small odd symbols, squares, crosses, things like that. All of those symbolize something special about the German military. They had to memorize all of those symbols because you're probably not going to find a sign, anything that's labeled. They're going to use symbols. And they had to, I recently came across one of the manuals that it wasn't just the German army. They had to know these for pretty much everybody. Now, the German section at Ritchie's primary focus, of course, was interrogating prisoners of war. Most of our German-speaking European Ritchie boys specialized in interrogations. During the duration of the war, Camp Ritchie also housed POWs. So it wasn't just equipment that they transported for practice. They also had the real people to practice on. You had mainly Germans and Italians, a small group of Italians. I want to say it was just over 1,500 POWs were kept at Camp Ritchie. There were also several other camps located to us, or local to us, like Camp Sharp, but they also utilized POWs. This gave the Ritchie boys the opportunity to utilize the methods and the principles of interrogating that they had been taught. I mentioned Colonel Warndorf a couple of times. I mentioned him at the beginning of the lecture as contributing to the Ritchie boys and their principles of interrogation. Well, he was remembered by Guy Stern for taking the original 16 principles founded by the British and for a successful interrogation, I'll say, and reducing them to 5. And of course, there's follows. Number 1 was exhibit superior knowledge to the prisoner. This mainly German military and your superiors. Know as much as you can. Serve as a friend to him. I want to say it was some 70 or 80% of most of the militaries in general were smokers, so provide cigarettes or special privileges. Number 3, introduce a subject of common interest. This could be art, music, soccer, or football, if you're over there, depending on, of course, who you're interrogating. Number 4 was let the POW speak on his own subject, then pick a particular part and expand on it. Number 5, play on the POW's sense of anxiety, i.e. their threats to their families and the Russians. I don't know how many of you have seen the 60 Minutes, but Guy Stern talks about dressing up like a Russian and trying to intimidate people into speaking. We didn't threaten violence. We did mostly psychological things like that, or our guys did, I'll say. These principles taught in training were instrumental in making those Ritchie boys as successful as they were in interrogations. Now, working with the POWs wasn't just interrogating them. There were also, they had to know the rules of warfare. They had to know the rules for handling POWs. And on the screen is a diagram of how to clear POWs from camp, how to move them. You can imagine moving your own battalion of American soldiers that are cooperative as probably fairly much easier than a half a battalion of German soldiers that don't want to budge. So they had to know the ins and outs of everything regarding POWs. One other area for Camp Ritchie, I would like to mention that the Ritchie boys, especially our refugee Ritchie boys, were part of, was the MRBC, the Mobile Radio Broadcasting Company, which numbered around 300. It was its own unit at Camp Ritchie. It had its own barracks, its own motor pool, printing section, broadcasting section. And while the MRBC did consist, as the name implies, of mobile radio broadcasting, they also handled other propaganda services. The propaganda section consisted of 40 men, mostly, again, made up of our European refugees. Due to their linguistic and communication skills, but not just that, their knowledge of the culture. Knowledge of the culture plays into how you can communicate with people the best. So they were responsible for assessing the enemy's morale, as well as using their prior knowledge to develop and produce all types of propaganda, both radio and print. These materials these materials on the, it would help if I changed it, sorry, I apologize. The materials on the screen, the leaflets, were actually the ones that would be dropped out of airplanes in order to encourage the surrender of the Germans. They did figure out early in the war that if it was too fantastical, the Germans would mark it off as it's just American propaganda. I want to say one of them mentioned you were able to get eggs. I think that was you were fed eggs, and they thought that was just American propaganda. So they didn't listen to it. These were a bit more convincing, especially having the president's signature on them, or on one of them at least. Now, the Mobile Broadcasting Company also had men that did this in teams overseas, which was by far one of the more dangerous jobs. They would ride around on a Jeep with a megaphone speaking in German talking in a way to encourage soldiers to surrender. The military quickly learned this is just making your men a rolling target. Several of our Ritchie boys were actually killed this way, but it was still fairly successful. Now, all of the training, of course, culminated into a group of soldiers that would end up being responsible for 60+% of all actionable intelligence. That means you can use it. You can do something with it. During World War II, the Ritchie boys were in every major battle during the war, and they greatly contributed to the efforts to collect information for the Nuremberg trials, acting as interrogators and interpreters, also writing up several reports, and many stayed behind to continue this process even after the war had technically ended. A large portion of the Ritchie boys returned home, but unfortunately, and I would like to try to mention some of those that did not, because people often think you're in intelligence, it's a protected spot, but it was highly dangerous. Unfortunately, the two most notable deaths were that of Staff Sergeant Kurt R. Jacobs and Tech 5 Murray Zappler of the 106th Infantry Division IPW Team 154, who were murdered as POWs. They were captured shortly after the Battle of the Bulge by Kurt Bruns, and Jacobs and Zappler were unfortunately identified by two German POWs that they had previously interrogated as being Jews from Berlin. And they were illegally executed by firing squad. It's a very sad story, sorry, it makes me choke up a bit. But Bruns faced a similar execution. In fact, I believe he was the first criminal of war to be executed by the U.S. military. And he was turned in by several of his own soldiers for his actions, but of course he claimed it wasn't him. There, of course, were several more killed on the front lines in Europe as well as in the Pacific. But we try to remember all of those that made that ultimate sacrifice. And I didn't change the slide again. I'm sorry, I'm changing two slides at once. These are pictures from overseas that we recently got this summer, and one collection, the one's closest to me, that's the label on the back of it, 4 Yanks, 8 Heinies on Main Street, and then the bottom is what gets me. 2 minutes before, we were pointing loaded Tommy guns at one another. We were fortunate to have, you don't always find pictures that actually have labels and details about what just happened, so this was fortunate. And then the rest of these, from one of Hitler's homes, the Eagle's Nest, I think it was. And these are from the Frank Adler collection we have, and this Christopher Gallen's collection. But it shows the devastation of Nuremberg trial of Nuremberg, as well as this was his Frank Adler's IPW team. So it gives you an idea of what our guys did and where they were. So some notable Ritchie boys. After the war, of course, many Ritchie boys went on to have illustrious careers, many in politics and the arts. As mentioned, Ritchie boys were a diverse group from all over the world, all different backgrounds. And here are some of the most recognizable. Yes, I have all of them labeled. First, of course, they were rather well known when they got to Camp Ritchie, the first two. David Rockefeller, which is the famous banker and grandson of Standard Oil founder John D. Rockefeller. I think he was fluent in French. Archibald Roosevelt, grandson of President Roosevelt, became a CIA officer. He spoke 20 languages, if I'm not mistaken. William Warfield, one of my favorites, African-American Ritchie boy, who, when he showed up to Ritchie, said that they had no idea what to do with him because they weren't expecting to be African-American. But he was a great contribution to the composite school unit because of his experience, and he went on to become a famous bass baritone, opera singer, if you don't know. And he was well known for his onstage work as well as in Hollywood, winning a Grammy in 1984. We also had 34 African-American Ritchie boys total, and several of them did go overseas and serve. William Warfield's just became one of the more famous ones. Peter von Eyck had come over to the States in the 30s, who after the war returned to Germany and became a star in West German cinema. Tony Strobel became an illustrator for Disney cartoons, or Disney comics. Eric Pleskow was the film producer and co-founder of Orion Films. John Chafe was the 66th governor of Rhode Island and the U.S. Secretary of the Navy for a short time. J.D. Salinger, a famous American author, best known for Catcher in the Rye. Vernon Walters was an Army officer and diplomat, most notably served as Deputy Director of the CIA in the 1970s and was an ambassador to the United Nations in the 80s. Ralph Baer, one that I like a lot and my kids like because of this, he was an engineer and an inventor, best known as the father of video games. Why my kids like him. And his most prominent invention was, of course, the home game console and the game Pong, which was modeled after the game of table tennis. I even remember playing that game. It never got boring. So those are a few of the ones that went on after the war. Now, the Ritchie Boy legacy, of course, lives on. Though we do cover the whole history of Fort Ritchie at our museum, we have a substantial exhibit to the Ritchie Boys. Like I said, it covers half of our museum at least. Our exhibit was actually put together by the late Guy Stern and several other Ritchie Boys and Ritchie Boy experts such as Stephen Goodell, who has been a well of information for me, to say the least. We recently updated it this past May by rearranging the exhibit and adding more exhibit items, but also an interrogations tent. I found when I first started at Ritchie, when young people would engage me in conversation on the Ritchie Boys and we would discuss interrogations, their mind immediately went to violence. And that's not what the Ritchie Boys did at all. They revolutionized interrogations. They used psychological warfare. And we decided that we wanted to put in an interrogation tent. We have World War II era folding chairs where they sit down and they listen to the Ritchie Boys talk about various topics, such as how they accomplished their interrogations, why they wanted to serve, about their more psychological methods, and various different points of interest, such as what kind of information they would collect and the effects of that, because it wasn't just intelligence that we could use to, move people. They saved lives, hundreds of thousands of lives by a lot of the intelligence they collected. So we added that recently to give young people and anybody a place to sit and listen to the Ritchie Boys talk. We're eventually working on adding a field table that they would have used and adding scans of interrogation reports, which I don't think we were ever supposed to end up getting, but letting them be able to sit and read some of what actually the Ritchie Boys did, because these reports weren't simple, hey, we caught this guy, this is what he said. It was very ins and outs of your day, ins and outs of handling the POWs, very detailed information. Of course, the Ritchie History Museum and Research Center, which unfortunately I didn't have a picture of to add yet. It's not in the best shape at the moment. The Ritchie History Museum was physically opened in June of 2023. With the mission of sharing the history of Fort Ritchie as it is a vital piece of both Maryland history as well as American military history. We have several wonderful exhibits, a section to the ice harvest, which we recently had somebody donate an actual horse-drawn ice saw, every bit as long as I am tall. We have, of course, Maryland National Guard, and of course the Ritchie Boys, to the later Fort Ritchie and the 7th Signal Command that Fort Ritchie was home to for quite a while before the base was BRAC'd, which is closed, Base Realignment and Closure Act, in 1998. Closed several World War II era bases. Unfortunately, we were one of them. But we also cover a little bit of our efforts to revitalize the historic site. It was all but abandoned, or most of the historic buildings were all but abandoned. They were vandalized, falling down, and it was such a shame that they started dilapidating the way they were. But it's now privately owned by John Krumpetich and his wife Joyce, and they're more or less turning it into what I would call a historic business park. When the base BRAC'd, the poverty level in our area rose by over 12%, which if you ever come to Cascade, you'll realize is quite large because we have a very small population. So their efforts to bring back the base, and of course we were one of the first businesses on the fort, and we're also active in the preservation of a lot of the historic buildings there. So. I want to thank you all for listening, and I hope you were able to take away a little bit more about the Ritchie boys and the Ritchie boy training, and of course a little bit about our museum. If you would like to read more in depth, because this book makes it really hard for me to do these kind of lectures because an hour is not enough time. The Ritchie Boy Secrets by Beverly Driver Eddy, who's local to us. She was a professor at Dickinson College. The late Dan Gross basically gave all of his 25 years of research to her. And she, as well as the other Ritchie boy, who I consider Ritchie boy experts, put together this book. And Beverly did a wonderful job talking about all of the individual activities going on at Ritchie, such as MIRS and PAC-MIRS, which is the Military Intelligence Research Section, and the Pacific Military Research Section, who were vital in us winning in the Pacific as well. She also does the link I added up top is to biographies that are on our page. She writes individual biographies on individual Ritchie boys and Ritchie girls. Let's say about every 3 months she finishes up one, and she allows us to post her wonderful work. And it's truly fantastic because she doesn't stop with what they did, like just Camp Ritchie. She starts at the beginning of their life and talks till the end and writes till the end. And these are individual stories that deserve to be told, which I'm so glad you guys are able to tell your grandfathers, your fathers. And it's an honor to be here with you guys to be able to see his items. So do we have any questions?